Hi, friends. Welcome to Tea with Jess. I'm really pleased today to be talking with a very dear friend of mine who also served as a young adult volunteer through the Presbyterian Church USA the same year that I did. Today I'm talking with my friend Michelle Muñiz. Michelle is a disaster recovery coordinator in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where she works with Presbyterians for Disaster Assistance. And today we're going to be talking about what recovery work has looked like on the island of Puerto Rico, not only post-Hurricane Maria in 2017, but also in light of the earthquakes that happened earlier this year, of Tropical Storm Isaias, which caused a great deal of flooding this year, and also what the pandemic means for this island and recovery efforts. So I hope that you enjoy our conversation, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Hi, Michelle.
Hello, Jess. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Just in the middle of hurricane season, but we're all good here in Puerto Rico.
This moment, things are good.
This moment, exactly.
So, Michelle, tell me about your current call. How are you serving the Presbyterian Church down in Puerto Rico?
So right now, I'm currently the disaster recovery coordinator for the Presbytery of San Juan. We have a disaster recovery coordinator since Hurricane Maria hit, as part of the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance response here in Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. So we have a disaster recovery coordinator in each one of our three presbyteries. So I'm currently working in the San Juan region, but I also have two colleagues that are working on the Northwest and Southwest region. And we also work along other host site coordinators who are the ones that are getting in charge of volunteer housing and lodging and meals and all that stuff. So this is part of the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance work after Hurricane Maria hit, and then we have been continuing the work as we are dealing with the aftermath and long-term recovery. One of the things that I always like to say is that PDA is not like a first responder. So as we focus on the work here in Puerto Rico through PDA in our communities, we're talking about long-term recovery. Mm-hmm. So we're talking that the plan is to be here for a little while, and how do we, contribute to the recovery of our communities. And something else that I also like to highlight is that this is not something that it's only through our Presbyterian churches. Is PDA also partners with local and grassroots organizations that are doing amazing work, mm-hmm. and they also contribute. So when people ask, like, where does the money go when I donate to PDA? It is for the mission and recovery of our congregations or our communities where our churches are, but it's also organizations that are doing the work of the recovery, mm-hmm. Here. So we get to work alongside that. I get to not only work alongside our congregations in terms of how to fill a grant or how to identify what are the needs in the communities, but also work alongside those grassroots organizations that perhaps may not have any relationship with the Presbyterian Church until this moment. And sort of like explaining how this partnership could look like. And, there are different ways to do partnership. And then the third part, which is most of my time, which has been different this summer, but is working with the volunteers. So everything that has to do with volunteer placement, volunteers coming through PDA to Puerto Rico, to the San Juan region, and staying at our host site in San Juan, all the way to the programming that we will have during the week. When we not only talk about service, but we also talk about some issues that are affecting our communities, to provide some context in terms of this is where we are, this is the work that we're doing, but these are all these issues that are happening before you come here. So that's a little bit in a nutshell of what I get to do.
Yeah, well, which is great, because not only are you getting to do sort of on the ground missions with people that need assistance, which I think is how the church sort of traditionally imagines missions, right? But you're also doing work to sort of undermine the systems. And I think that's something that's really important. And maybe for some people that's become important in the last few months as they become more aware of systems of oppression that are at work in the world. But I think that's something really important that we need to talk about more in our church missional work, is that we've shifted away from this sort of colonial model to a more grassroots model that's really geared towards independence and self-development.
Absolutely. So, and I think there's a lot of things that people think, oh, so this is happening after Maria hit. And there are a lot of issues or like challenges that were happening before, that some of them are put in the spotlight after Maria. Some of them are, increasing in terms of numbers, but there were issues that were happening before that have affected not only the way that we were able to cope with the hurricane, but everything that has to do with recovery, then, you know, there's all this ramifications and connections of issues that Puerto Rico also faces. So it provides a little bit of context into, okay, so we can talk about the hurricane, but we also have to talk about, you know, what's our role walking in and being here this week and then leaving. What does that mean? So in terms of context, that helped our volunteers to understand, okay, now when I go home, how can I continue the conversation? How can I keep in touch with the people in Puerto Rico? How can I keep in the loop with the issues that are happening there?
Yeah, that's awesome and so important. And I'm wondering, right, like what drew you to disaster recovery work in particular? And I know we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but you started this work after Hurricane Maria, right? So like what on earth did that look like, Michelle? What was it like walking into this disaster recovery work in the wake of such a huge traumatic event?
I remember the day before Maria hit Puerto Rico, I was watching like on a Facebook Live. There's a very famous meteorologist here that every time she goes live, everybody's like, oh my God, we have to pay attention, right? Like everybody here trusts her. And I remember she said, there's gonna be a before and after Maria. Like at the point that it was imminent, this was unprecedented in so many ways. But I was still living in Miami. So it was hard to be, like to see that happening from far away, knowing that it was gonna be hard and complicated. And as I was already thinking about transitioning and moving back home. So it was sort of like, I'm not there, but I will be. So coming back, I moved to Puerto Rico a few months after Hurricane Maria hit. And I remember I will see some areas and be like, oh my God, this is devastated. And everybody will tell me, well, this looks green now. Like this is looking way better than it did, right? So I got to a point where people were able to identify or to witness some, you know, some things were getting better. But I was able to see sort of like the coming back to a ravaged island, you know, like no electricity. And even when I moved back to my mom's house, and we didn't have electricity for a few months. So even me arriving a couple months after the hurricane, I still lived without electricity for a couple of months as well, and sort of figuring out, you know, how to get things, and, you know, like you can only imagine. So it was a hard process to arrive at that time. And it was, you know, I don't think I would have been able to do this work if it was somewhere else. So it really helped that I was coming home. So in terms of like, I was, you know, feeling overwhelmed, or I was feeling like, oh my God, this is looking horrible. But at the same time, it was home. So I was reconnecting with the church that I grew up at. I was reconnecting with the friends that I already had. So it was sort of coming back to this different Puerto Rico, and sort of like not experiencing the hurricane like being here, but sort of from afar, and walking into, you know, how can I help? And in that process, as I was talking about PDA being long-term recovery, the position was not posted until a little bit further, when PDA and the local church sort of figure out, okay, this is what we need, or this is what we're gonna look like. So with the experience that I already had in Miami working with volunteers, that was something that that's why I became interested. I don't think if you would ask me like several years ago, do you see yourself working in recovery work? I don't think I would have even imagined. Yeah. But then I find myself working here, and again, like I think there's some sense of belonging that I get to do this home. So I came back home, and it was this bumpy transition, but at the same time, I get to be a part of the recovery. So that really gives me like life, like that gets me out of bed when I go to work. So yeah.
That's and thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of people assume, especially our young people, right, that like you do this training for this job, and then this is what you do, and that's how it works, right? Or like you have this passion in your life, and then you do that passion and you don't do anything else, right? And what you're saying is that what happened in this context was it happened to be a place where you were from, you happened to be moving back, right? You were in the right place at the right time, and you had the right skill set for God to use you in this capacity, and you were open to being used that way, you know? And I think that's a really imperative witness for a lot of people to hear in our churches. And as I said, especially for our young people. So thank you for that, Michelle. That's, yeah. I wonder how many people that are working in disaster recovery were like, I'm going to work in disaster. You know, it doesn't seem like a very natural thing, but what do I know? But anyway, I think that's really interesting. And I'm wondering too, how has your faith been shaped as a result of the disaster recovery work that you're doing? And especially in the context that you're in, right? Where you're in your home city, working with people you know, reconnecting with your home church. What is that like, and how is that helping you to grow?
I think like I have, before I share how it was changed here, has been challenged. I have to talk about my YAV year in Miami. When I did my young adult program here in Miami, there were a lot of things about the church that were sort of like challenged in my mind, and like, how can we be the church outside of the sanctuary? So I'm taking a lot of what I got from that YAV year, and sort of I was able to witness it when I came back home. But I remember, and I always use this illustration because it was something that I really enjoy seeing as we were walking in some of the distributions and events that we did from the presbytery to give food and emergency supplies. One of our churches, the facility outside got destroyed, so they had to put all the things like donations and all that stuff like right in the sanctuary. And I know how jealous people are of this, you know, holy space that is made out, you know, for you to enter and be in silence and reflection, and you go and you worship, sort of this space that, and to see that filled with pallets and boxes. I know it was a little bit controversial for many people, but for me to walk in, there was like, this is the church, right? So perhaps, you know, because of the circumstances, we were challenged to be a different church. But for me, it was like, yeah, like if our sanctuaries and our communities are for the community around, then we're doing the good work. It's not only for our little group of people. So I was glad to see that. And in that sense, sort of thinking about, I may see myself in a church like this, in a church that works, you know, connecting with the community and not necessarily bringing people here so, you know, we can have it. And I think, you know, everything works for different people, but in the midst of the disaster aftermath, like some people walked into our churches to look for emergency supplies that had never set a foot in our congregations. And I was glad that it was not a requirement to ask them to become members of the Presbyterian Church USA, right? Like, it was just like, no, I mean, you need a flashlight, we have a flashlight, then you can take it, right? Like, you're hungry, we have a hot meal, then you can take it. And I think, you know, as I saw that, I was like, this is what church should look like all the time, right? And I think there's a concept here of community in our Latino culture, especially in Puerto Rican culture. Like, there's a sense of that. So we were able to see that in the aftermath after Maria. Like, we were able to see, you know, neighbors that had never spoken to each other suddenly, you know, becoming friends and all that stuff. Same happened with churches that are close and nearby and perhaps haven't done anything together, started doing things together because they were in the same community. So for me to see that, you know, gave me hope of there's, you know, we can still be the church doing all these different things. And we can still be, you know, a place where people can find, you know, feeling safe, can find whatever they need. And it doesn't necessarily include a worship service or gathering as a community. So in that sense, like I was happy to see that. And in the midst of everything, like when you work with this on a daily basis, it's overwhelming. Like, there's some time that you're like, I don't have anything else to, like, I cannot help everybody. I remember having the registration in one of the events and asking for somebody's address. And she was like, I don't have any address because I lost my home. And how do you, you know, where do you find hope? You know, like, how do you offer hope? How do you offer, in that reflection about faith, you know, I was glad that we were still being there and just, you know, we were still providing the space for people to say, you know what, this is frustrating and this is sad, and, you know, I'm angry, or I'm grieving, and there was space for that, without the the requirement of let's pray after this conversation, or let's do something part of our ritual that we're used to, but not everybody is.
Mm-hmm.
So I was glad to see that was beyond, and it was a different church. So that really shaped into, I want to be a part of a church that works like this. Like it connects with the community, and it doesn't feel like you have to become something, but you are already part of the community. So
come as you are, kind of. Yeah,
exactly.
And that's how all our churches should be, right? So yeah. That's awesome. So I'm also curious too, Michelle, as you might know, we're living in this very strange moment in history. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're being.
What do you mean?
Yeah, I know, it's very different. But I know that in hurricane season, right? Puerto Rico has already been affected by Isaias pretty significantly, and I've seen images of the flooding that's happened there. And on top of that, right, we have this COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'm wondering how that pandemic has affected life and specifically recovery work in Puerto Rico. Because I know I was watching an interview with you a while ago, and you mentioned that like before the pandemic, before the earthquakes, you still had over 1,000 homes that had blue tarps instead of roofs. Poverty, as we talked about, systems is a real issue in Puerto Rico that hasn't gone away. So I'm wondering how COVID is impacting those realities right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it definitely put a lot of things on hold. At the very, very beginning, people were like, what is this quarantine thing? Like, what are we doing? But the reality is that everything that was recovery related, reconstruction related, everything had to be put on hold. In our case, we're not receiving PDA volunteers, but there are other organizations that do the same work as us that have been holding all travel for that. So those organizations here that rely on volunteers coming have been also being affected because they don't have all the labor that they need, or they have to work with whoever local volunteers they have. Yeah. But I think one of the challenging things, and we talk about hurricanes and we talk about the pandemic, but the southwestern region has been also suffering from some earthquakes and seismic activity. So people are like, okay, so if there's an earthquake, I go outside, but if it's a hurricane, I stay inside. But there's a pandemic, how do we respond? And Puerto Ricans have a great sense of humor, and you will see a lot of memes making jokes about that. But at the same time, it's like now you have to rethink everything. How do you respond to everything? Because now you have a pandemic. Now you have to have face masks, or now you need to be watching your hands or using different equipment. So in that sense, it has been challenging, especially rural communities that don't have access to a lot of supplies, to figure out how we're gonna handle this. And when the quarantine started and lockdown started, a lot of businesses closed, and we are still seeing, a lot of businesses saying we're not opening again. Like there's no way we can figure this out. So that also has an effect in more unemployment, or more students that cannot go to school, and that has been challenging. Puerto Rico was one of the first U.S. jurisdictions that started quarantine. So at the very, very beginning, it was fairly controlled. But as they started, putting some flexibility with the private sector, then we saw an increase in numbers, which I think it was expected. So I think the fear is that if it goes out of control, we do not have the health infrastructure to hold that. And another challenge that we've had during COVID is that we don't have the authority to close our airports. So we don't control if we have people coming to the island. Like we can have all this quarantine and all this lockdown, but then we do not control all the flights that are still coming from other places to the island.
That makes sense based on the history of Puerto Rico and your relationship with the United States, with the mainland. But that's really interesting, and I hadn't thought about that, because you're not a state, right? So you don't have states' rights, right? But you're also not a federal nation, so you don't have your own federal rights either. That's right. That's enlightening, and I imagine very scary, feeling like you don't have that agency that you need to be able to make decisions. And I'm wondering too, like, how is it with things like water, right? Because if you don't have electricity, then you can't get clean water, and then how do you wash your hands if you don't have clean water, right? Like, are those things you're having to come up against as well?
I mean, in some places, right, and especially when we're in a hurricane season, is fairly normal that electricity will go out or water service will be out at some point. So even in the midst of hurricane season, that's something that will happen. But now in the midst of this, how do I measure that I'm washing my hands with clean? Like, how clean is my water? I mean, I'm trusting 100% the tap water. Like, what does that mean? So it really depends on areas. Here, like, one of the things that we tell our volunteers that you can drink tap water here, but at the same time, it's something that you have to be conscious. You know, it's something that you have to continue. So almost everybody, like, people here fairly have access to clean water.
Okay.
But then if the infrastructure is shut down because, you know, there's an emergency or something, then it's not as easy as it is for some people. You know, people in the city get to find more resources and people in rural areas. One of the things that happened after the Hurricane Maria is that people went to rivers to get some water, which is super common. Like, if you live next to a river and you mostly grew up going down to the river and, you know, going and taking a bath and drinking water. But after the hurricane, there was some water that was polluted. And, you know, then we had a crisis about, like, no, don't get into the rivers and all that stuff. So again, it comes back to, depending on where you are and the circumstances around it, how would that look like? But again, like the example with the rivers, it's so common that people that live near rivers, you know, go there and that's it, and go and clean their clothes, for example, if there's no running water. So again, it really depends on the resources, and we've seen this in the aftermath, and we've seen this in the response of the earthquakes, and now in the pandemic, is those who have the resources will recover faster, and those who don't have the resources then will face longer, you know, time without getting fully recovered or getting the supplies.
Yeah, or they'll die. Right. Like, and I think
exactly.
That's the other thing, is that, like, if you don't have access to these things, this is a life or death issue.
Right.
And I don't know that we talk about that as much as we really should. But anyway, that's so with all of that going on, what you have the ear of America right now, Michelle, via this one YouTube video. How would you like people to come alongside you and your ministry right now? What do you need? How can we help you? Right? There's always prayer, and we do that for you. You know that, right? But, like, are there other things we could be doing more sort of tangibly that would be serving you?
Absolutely. And I think this is a great question, because I think there are different ways to support us or to walk alongside us. You know, prayer is great and we appreciate it. And I do appreciate when people text like, hey, I see there's a storm coming your way. Because I know not all Puerto Rican news are on the spotlight in the States. So it's always good to hear from some former volunteers say, hey, I saw on the news or I saw on the internet that there's a storm coming your way. How are you doing? So, you know, I don't want to overlook that or underestimate that. But sometimes it's about, like, what we need in the current moment. Like, at this point, people will ask me if we can send supplies. Like, I will always say either emergency supplies, like things that you will need during a hurricane, all the way to school supplies, as we're now walking into the new semester. And how is that going to look like now with the virtual education and all that stuff? But it really depends. Sometimes I will contact one of our churches, and some of our churches we will say, well, we actually need this. And if I get, you know, contacted by somebody, well, I can say, well, you know, this is exactly what this congregation needs to continue. So in terms of supplies, we've had former volunteers, the volunteers that have been here in Puerto Rico and are back home, and they have been sending some supplies for us. Some people have been sending their donations as well. And all that helps. And I think it's, you know, it's important as part of continuing the partnership. I think some of the volunteer trips serve as the conversation starter, and then they go home and they can continue contributing to the recovery efforts from home. but it is important, like sometimes, like I don't want this to be like, well, you send a check and that's it, right? It really helps like to keep in touch with the people, to share about what's going on. And I've been trying to keep people in the loop about what's going on in Puerto Rico. And sometimes I feel, I mean, sometimes I feel I'm like, every month I'm sending like, there's this new disaster like right now in Puerto Rico. And like, I don't want to sound like, like, oh, there's always this, hot mess of situations. But at the same way, like I'm aware that not all the Puerto Rican news are out there. So for me, it's important to keep people in the loop. And part of that is people, like keeping people in the loop with current events. But it is important that people learn about our history, about the dynamics that exist between Puerto Rico and the United States. Because when we understand that, then we can see why are other things that are happening. One of the things that we constantly share in terms of the aftermath of the hurricane is that we had countries like in the Central America that wanted to bring supplies, but because there's a law that controls our borders, because it's U.S. borders, then they had to take that ship to Florida, put everything in a ship with the American flag, and then be sent. By then, it's been like a month or so, so these are all things that were happening before, and it's important for me to tell people about them, but it's important for people to, to do their homework and look and say, hey, I'm going to read about this, and I'm going to read, what are the things that have been happening historically, and how many of them has been put on the spotlight after the hurricane. So it is important. And in terms of the Presbyterian Church, part of the beginning of the church was part of the Puerto Rico becoming a U.S. colony. So how can we reconcile our church, our denomination, the one that we have a sense of belonging and we have a sense of call? How can we also reconcile with how perhaps as an institution we're also complicit? So it is a responsibility as Christians, and it is a responsibility to really keep in the loop and reading about it. And my idea is not to ask all the volunteers to read 20,000 books before they arrive, but it always makes a difference when you do some reading and you do your homework. You come to Puerto Rico and you put in context all that information that you received, and you add up some other context. So when you go back, you're like, okay, well, this is what you see on the news, but this is what I experienced when I went to Puerto Rico. So, that's important. And long-term partnerships are extremely important. Like for us here, it really makes a difference when we have a group that stays in touch, a church that continues, like keep us in the loop about what they're doing, or continue, making activities or something, sort of thinking about us or to support us. It really, really makes a difference, because now we can talk about congregations that we feel like they're family. It's no longer like this random church that is coming here and they left, but it's a church that we have a relationship with. So, and that really makes a difference, and that's hard, right? Like that takes time, and like it's not as Instagrammable as you building a house and say, well, we set up this roof. But it really, like, we can see the fruit of that, of those partnerships. And I can testify of how important they are, not only for me, but for the local leaders here, the local people in the congregations that get to see other people coming and taking from their time to come and spend a week with us. So
yeah, that's a good word, Michelle. Everything that you just said vibes with me. So thank you for sharing that. And we're excited at Alamance to be in partnership with you. And we just started that relationship when COVID happened, and unfortunately we had to shift our trip around, but we hope that this continues to be the beginning of a beautiful relationship, to quote Casablanca, right? But on that note, what's bringing you joy and hope right now? So where are you finding God's grace and God's comfort in your context, in this larger context?
When we started hosting volunteers, our host site is in a very rural neighborhood in San Juan, very densely populated neighborhood in San Juan. When we started there, it was very odd for the neighbors to see some people coming from the States and walking around. And we're like, who are these people? Like, what are they doing? Why are they all wearing like the blue shirts, right? So it was like sort of like this process of not only showing the neighborhood to the volunteers, but also, introducing the ministry that we were doing in their neighborhood. But now, like a couple of years later, we've seen the product of that. Like we've seen that people walk around and say, no, you're the guys that work with the volunteers, right? Or, oh no, you're the guys that work with the recovery process. And that really makes a difference in terms of, it's not like a random ministry that is there, but it's something that is part of the community. And we did a food distribution recently, and we had more volunteers from the community than from the church that we were hosting the event, right? And what that tells me is not that, like our church members are lazy, but what that told me was we are connected with the community enough that they feel comfortable saying, no, I want to help. I want to contribute somehow. So I've been able to see that. And I think that really brings me joy, because now I get to walk around those streets, because that's not the neighborhood that I grew up at, right? Like I've been working at this neighborhood for 3 years now. But now I walked and, I get to recognize the neighbors. People get to recognize me at the same time that they recognize the rest of the staff. And I really find joy in that, like, because it becomes not like a ministry of the church, but of the neighborhood. And people feel as they own the ministry at the same time as us. So it becomes and I love just walking around and getting to talk with people from the community, asking me like, what is this about? And then I get to share, well, there's our volunteers that are coming and are contributing to the recovery work, or we're doing this distribution and we're, just distributing stuff for you guys. So that has been good. But there was an image this past week after Isaias storm affected us, of this flooded street near here in Loíza, which is a small town in the northeast coast. And the picture was a flooded street, completely flooded, with this kid, 12, 13 years old, riding a bike with water until like his hip. And this kid was like smiling, like legit smiling. And there are a lot of things there's a lot of things. I even share the picture with some people. I'm like, what do you think about this picture? And some people are like, what if the water is polluted? Or like, what is it, like, I don't know if this is safe. But from what I saw is a younger generation that has been facing hurricanes, like disasters like Maria, that have been surviving earthquakes, and now they're surviving storms, and they still find joy into just, let's take the bike and go through the flooded street. So it really taught me, like, okay, if this young generation still finds a way to smile and have fun in the middle of a flooding, then I think we can continue the work, and we can continue. So, there's a lot of resiliency and a lot of these things, it's not that we decided to be resilient, it's that we just have been facing a lot of stuff. But when I saw that image, I was like, okay, like, we can still smile in the midst of all this things, in the midst of all this anxiety that brings, when a storm is getting closer. So to witness that in younger generations, or to see the community as involved and connected, like, that really gives me joy. And when I wake up and I say, well, I have to go to work, it really get me out of bed, because I know I'm going to get to witness that at work. So
that's awesome. And it sounds like, right, just because a pandemic is happening doesn't mean your work has ceased. You're still distributing food, you're still sorting supplies, you're still serving this island that you love so much, that is your home. So that's great. Were there any other sort of final truth nuggets you want to share with us, Michelle, during this time to sort of conclude our conversation?
I think I shared a lot of the things that I wanted to say, but just keep Puerto Rico in the loop. It's easy. One of the challenges is that when we talk about Hurricane Maria, something that happened locally. When we talk about the earthquakes, it's something that happened here locally. But in terms of pandemic, something that has happened globally, and everybody's sort of figuring out how to deal with that. So it's harder to put what's going on in Puerto Rico in the spotlight, or for people to notice, because everybody's sort of like figuring it out. So for me, it's important that people, just stay in the loop and follow, not only, follow the news, but, follow what the church is doing and how the church is responding. Now, like, if you go to PDA's website, it will be like hurricane, earthquakes, like, it will be like all this list of things. But that's how the church is invested in the ministry, like in the ministry here and the work here. So just invite our church and the people just to keep in the loop of what's going on in Puerto Rico, that go beyond and read about a little bit about history and connect with us. Like, there are so many ways we can do partnerships. There are so many ways we can connect, even in the midst of a pandemic, that we can just have a conversation and answer some questions, all the way to, formally doing a fundraiser or something like that. But there's so many ways that we can figure out how that partnership is going to look like. That I'm just looking forward to continue connecting with our churches and continue the work that we're doing.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. As always, this has been both a delightful and enlightening conversation. And I'm so very blessed that I get to name you as one of my friends. It's such a gift to have you in my life. And I was hoping that you would conclude us with a prayer.
Absolutely.
Right.
Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity that we get to share about a little bit of the work that we're doing here, but also the challenges and the invitation that you give us every single day to connect with the community, to connect the holiness of our church or our fancy sanctuaries, all the way to put them to the service of the people around. Thank you so much for the opportunity that we get to work and contribute somehow to this, but also give us the opportunity to be aware and to continue noticing those little details that sometimes go overlooked, into how we can be a better church. How can we be a better example of what the bringing the kingdom of God means in the midst of all this. Thank you for the joy that we can find in the midst of the storm, and thank you for the opportunity that we get to connect and continue the networking within our church and within the organizations that we're working with, so we can continue working in the long-term recovery of Puerto Rico. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for the opportunity that we get to talk about this. In the name of Jesus, en el nombre de Jesús, hemos orado. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Michelle. I'll see you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.